Okay, hello students. This is a PowerPoint about Rossetti's poem Memory. And you will notice, unlike every other PowerPoint on Rossetti, we have two dates and therefore two ages for this poem, which I will explain on the next slide. So, what's really interesting about this poem is it was not originally written as one poem. Part 1 was published in 1857 and then part 2 was added in 1865. So there were 8 years between part 1 and part 2. So you can definitely comment on that if you're thinking about the structure and the difference between the two parts of this poem. But how interesting it is that Rossetti has returned to a topic, and I think it's fair to say a feeling and a time. It's a lyric poem. It's a poem about personal feelings and strong emotions. And she's returned to it, maybe, I think we could say, a bit older and a bit wiser in the second half. So let's have a look at both halves. In part 1, what it's about is a first-person speaker reflecting on a momentous decision in their life when they decided to renounce a person they were in love with. It's not clear whether the love was reciprocated, whether it was, what's the word, unrequited love, but either way, they decided to renounce it. They kept their feelings to themselves when they were in love and when they then renounce that love. So there's a lot in this poem about repressing and keeping your feelings secret and hidden. The poem is about how difficult that decision was, how it wasn't easy, and how the speaker made it alone themselves and trusted their own judgment. But the poem doesn't end with that decision, and that part 1 doesn't end with that decision. It ends with the speaker reflecting on the amount of pain that decision caused them. So you get the sense in that poem that this is a fresh reflection on a very painful moment and decision in someone's life. Whereas when we get to part 2, there seems to be a calmer, more reflective, mature way of thinking about the same episode. The same speaker looking back on this now from a distance. So the speaker has still tender memories of the beloved, but she still keeps them secret. And the feelings towards the beloved have changed. In particular, she no longer idolises their beloved, and we'll explain what idolising means in a bit later on. The speaker also reflects on their age and talks about themselves now, 30-something. Nowadays, we wouldn't think of that as middle-aged. But thinking about the Victorian ideas about the marriage market, a woman over 30 was pretty much not going to get married. And she was seen as being now in that third stage of her life. She was like a matron for the rest of her life and going to be a spinster. So all she looks forward to now is when they will be together in heaven, as we know, not an uncommon idea in Rossetti's poetry. So these two parts, although they are both 4-line stanzas, they're very different in structure. So in part 1, we have mostly in the past. Yeah, so she's describing events in the past from the perspective of just having made this big decision. Part 2 talks about the present. The rhyme schemes are different. Part 1 has alternate rhymes, A, B, whereas part 2 has a more unusual and possibly less, I was going to say ordered, but slightly jarring, A, B, A. And that's also shown on the page layout, that the B lines are indented. The first 4 stanzas of part 1 are end stopped. They're all sentences, and the sentences end at the end of each stanza. So when I'm saying about A, B, and the end stopping, there's something quite traditional, structured about the way that one's written. Part 2 is a bit more fluid. So what you have is, rather than a full stop, you have the end of a clause. There my life centres. Stanza 2 opens, while winter comes and goes. So that's another clause of the same sentence. And similarly, between stanza 3 and 4, I no more bow my head or bend my knee there. On stanza 4, but often. And that clause opens with but. So there's much more linkage between the stanzas. So that creates a very different, I'm not supposed to use the word flow in English literature to talk about poems, but I think in that specific context you could talk about the more fluid movement between the stanzas, whereas in stanza 1, break, break, break. In a bit of a poem, it's all about breaking things. So the tone of voice in the first part. The first person voice is strong and decisive, and there's lots of actions. I nursed it, I hid it, I sat, I grieved, I shut, I stood, I faced, I took, no shaking of my hand, yeah, I broke it. So we'll get to that when it's the verbs of breaking and crushing and bracing. There's big, strong actions in here. So after she's weighed up whether she's, it's worth being in love with this chap or not, she broke her idol, braced her will. I broke it at a blow. I laid it cold, as dead, crushed in my heart. So it's really strong, violent imagery of ending this love and this feeling. This also, so that kind of language emphasizes the stoicism that this stanza, this part is about. That she doesn't share these feelings. She does this all herself. She keeps it all in. I grieved alone, and nothing said. In joy I sat alone, even so I grieved alone. And that goes over a line, and nothing said. It's mostly in the past tense, as I mentioned earlier, but in the last two stanzas, stanza 4 and stanza 5, we get some present tense, which makes it more exciting and dramatic. None know the choice I made. Yeah, so know is present tense, I made is past tense. So she's talking about now, after I've made the decision, nobody knows I made that decision. And then very strong, she says, I make it still. Yeah, so there's no regret. Yeah, I'm sticking to that decision I made. And then the last two lines of the final stanza of this part, my heart dies inch by inch. That's present tense. The time grows old in which I grieve. So we have this dramatic action that she did in the past and now how it's left her and how she's feeling about it. So it's really painful. She still would make that decision, but it's left her very sad and grieving and dying, her heart dying. So the language of death and mourning is used even though the beloved may not have literally died. In fact, well, let's think. You can think about that, but I don't think he's literally died. The imagery in part 1, she talks about when she was in love, when she had this feeling of love, she nursed it in her bosom. So it's a kind of a maternal image, because nursing is a word for actually breastfeeding. That's what you're doing, a nursing mother or a nurse. That's what nurses were employed to do. But also to nurse something is to help it along, like a plant nursery. So it's an active keeping this feeling going. She nursed it in her bosom while it lived, but she hid it in her heart when it was dead. So the heart, it's a very obvious, widespread symbol, but Rossetti uses it a great deal and she means it. The heart is where your deepest emotions and feelings are. And so she means it when she says she hid it in her heart when it was dead. And later on she talks about her own heart dying. My heart dies inch by inch. So the deep heart is this stoicism, or this hiding of her feelings. So that my heart dies inch by inch really shows the slow, long-lasting pain this decision has caused her. So her heart isn't dead, it's dying really, really slowly. When she decides to make her decision, the image is of balances. I took the perfect balances and weighed. And she doesn't involve herself in the decision. She doesn't try and tip the scales one way or another. We know she's in love, but she remains objective and she holds the balances and she puts, this is my feeling for this chap. We don't know what she puts in the other side of the scale. She holds it up and she judges. Yeah, weighing things in scales is an image of judgment. So it suggests an objective decision, as does I didn't tilt the scales, no shaking of my hand. We have to infer what is on the other side of the scale. There are other poems of Rossetti's where she's more explicit about God and the demands of religion against being in love. But I think we may infer that here, particularly when we get to the second part about the idol bit. So in the second part, one of the strongest images is the image of a room. I don't think it's a literal room. in part one or in part two. I don't think it's a literal room. I think it's a symbol of a quiet, private place for a woman. So when she talks about, I shut the door to face the naked truth, and I stood alone, somewhere where the speaker can be alone and unobserved. And for Victorian ladies, you would be surprised by how few opportunities they actually had to be alone and unobserved. Their time was not their own. They were meant to give time and duty to their families, particularly the male member of their family, but also their mothers, their aunts. Their job was to serve others. So they couldn't just say, oh, I'm going to go upstairs and just read a book or something. I mean, they may have done that, but they had to justify time on their own, and maybe didn't even have a room of their own. Also, Victorian women are not supposed to be active in desire and love. And this is why she has to keep, when she's in love, she has to keep those feelings a secret. And then when she's grieving for that love, she has to keep that a secret too. So it's another poem about secrets, a bit like May, or certainly mysteries, not telling people things. So in part two, the room is slightly different, a room whereinto no one enters. The room symbolises her secret life, and particularly these feelings, this romance of the past that's only known to her. And the room here sounds like a shrine or a temple, where the memory is described as blessed, or I should say blessed maybe, and it's on a throne. So you can imagine this doesn't have to be a physical place. It could be closing your eyes and have a little daydream as she's remembering those happy times and she's remembering that person. I have a room whereinto no one enters save I myself alone. There sits a blessed memory on a throne. There my life centres. Okay, so he's still, this is really important to her, but now it's a memory. We also get in the second stanza of part two this imagery of the seasons, and they reflect time passing, and then they also reflect the speaker's age. So she's sitting in her room, remembering this time that's passed, and this moment, and time goes past her. Winter comes and goes, and then summer arrives, the bloodless lily and the warm rose of lavish summer. Lily represents virginity and purity and chastity, hence bloodless. I mean, it's white, therefore it's bloodless, but it's also bloodless because blood brings passion and love and feelings. The warm rose, that is the symbol of love, isn't it, and passion, particularly a red rose. So the bloodless lily and the warm rose of lavish summer. But then later on, in stanza 4 of part 2, she uses the seasons to describe her own age and life. Often in my worn life's autumn weather. So like I say, we might find it surprising for a woman of 37, 36, anyhow she's at this point, to think of herself as middle-aged, in the autumn of her life. Spring, summer, autumn, and then winter's when you're nearly dead. But that is how the speaker puts herself. So this idea that the person, the beloved, is an idol, in part 1, I know the choice I made and broke my heart, breaking mine idol. Yeah, so she describes the person she's in love with like an idol. It suggests, this is the most obvious point in the poem, that suggests that loving him conflicts with religious faith, because of the 10 commandments, the second is you are not to make for yourself an idol. This is the word. And what is an idol is any sort of statue of any image. So strictly speaking, there should be no images at all in churches. That's what the Protestants got very upset about with the Roman Catholics, and there's a lot of, if you ever see the facade of Wells Cathedral, Exeter Cathedral, all the statues have their heads knocked off because the Protestant reformers smashed all the stained glass windows and knocked all the heads off the statues because it was idol worship as far as they were concerned. Judaism, Islam, and strictly speaking, Christianity shouldn't have any images because of this danger that you'll end up worshipping the idol. But that can be in human life as well, that if you fall madly in love with a person, you end up worshipping them like an idol and not God. And in part 2, stanza 3, it seems to acknowledge that she did break that commandment, that the way she felt about this person was taking her away from God, because she said, I no more bow my head or bend my knee there, which suggests that when she was in love with him, she did idolise him. But he still sits on his little throne. He's still there. So, some of the themes in this poem, restrictions. I put ladies because, you know, I want to make this point that working class women were not being made to stay in their homes, and, you know, they weren't allowed to go out unchaperoned. It's a very class-based idea of femininity. So ladies, if you're a middle class or above lady, these are the restrictions on you. You're not supposed to fall in love. You're not supposed to speak your love, like in Twice. And you've got to keep those kinds of feelings secret to yourself. And also what I said to you about, you know, not having a room to yourself, not being meant to hang around indulging in your feelings all the time. We can talk about the conflict between divine and human love in this poem, particularly the idea that she'd made an idol of him, and that's why she had to break the idol. Disappointment. I know there was an exam question a couple of years ago about disappointment, but yeah, that once she did this, it wasn't like she was like, phew, I'm free of that terrible man now. It really hurt her and upset her, and she still thinks about him, so it's quite poignant. And memories. Yeah, the importance and the appeal of memories, especially of love affairs. I suppose we could also mention that idea of the dream and the promise of being together in paradise. I think how it will be in paradise when we're together. I'm aware there's more in this poem that I could have said, but this will be a very, very long PowerPoint if I did that. But I just will mention one more thing when she talks about having clear eyes. I watch there with clear eyes, because to be clear-eyed is to have no more illusions. So the sense that now she's older and wiser, she can see things a bit more clearly.